The cathedral had no roof, and the sky was a predator. Lyra Belcourt pressed her back against the cracked marble pillar, her shawl doing nothing to stop the wind from tearing through the holes in the fabric. The polar vortex screamed through the stone arches like a living thing, hungry and patient. Her fingers were blue, not pale, blue, the color of something already dead. She tried to unbutton her coat with hands that wouldn't obey. Baby Arya was crying, but the sound was getting weaker. That was worse than the screaming. Lyra knew what silence meant. She fumbled with the brass buttons, her knuckles cracking and bleeding as she forced them through the frozen buttonholes. "Please," she whispered. "Please, just a little longer." The iron gate slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed through the ruins like a gunshot. Lyra's head snapped up, her breath coming in short, visible bursts. Bastien Kyle stood on the other side of the bars, his thick wool fur coat making him look twice his size. He was smiling. The kind of smile that belonged on a man watching a dogfight. He pulled a heavy key from his pocket. The metal glinted in the moonlight as he turned it in the lock. The click was final. Absolute. Lyra scrambled to her feet, clutching Arya to her chest, and ran to the gates. Her bare feet slipped on the ice-slicked stone. "Bastien, please!" Her voice broke. "She's just a baby!" He took a long drink from his silver flask. The brandy steamed in the Arctic air. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, the heavy ring on his finger catching the light. The same ring he'd used to strike her face 3 days ago. "Nature is the only executioner I need, Lyra." His breath came in arrogant puffs. "Die quietly, so I don't have to pay for a grave." He laughed. The sound was swallowed by the wind as he turned and walked away, his boots crunching through the snow. Lyra screamed after him, but the vortex took her voice and shredded it into nothing. She shook the gates until her palms bled, but the iron didn't move. Bastien disappeared into the tree line. Lyra sank to her knees, the cold biting through her thin skirt like teeth. Arya's crying had stopped. That was the worst sound of all. The silence. Lyra pressed her ear to the baby's chest and heard the faint, fluttering heartbeat. Still alive. Still fighting. "Okay," Lyra whispered. "Okay, we're okay." She wasn't okay. The temperature was 30 below and the wind was only getting stronger. Lyra crawled back to the pillar, her legs shaking so badly she couldn't stand. She pressed her spine against the stone and finally got the coat open. The air hit her skin like a slap, but she didn't stop. She pulled Arya against her bare chest, skin to skin, and wrapped the coat around them both. The baby latched immediately. Lyra felt the pull, the familiar tug that had kept Arya alive for 6 months. But this time, it felt different, heavier. Like the baby was drinking more than milk. Lyra looked down and saw frost forming on her own eyelashes. Her toes were numb. She couldn't feel her left foot at all. "Just a little longer, Arya." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Just stay warm." The wind howled. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Summer afternoons. The bakery ovens. Her mother's hands. But the memories were slipping away, replaced by the white void pressing in from all sides. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, the rhythm becoming irregular. Arya kept drinking. Lyra's head lolled to the side. She was so tired. The kind of tired that felt like falling. She wondered if freezing to death was supposed to hurt this much, or if the stories were wrong. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her breath was coming slower now. The baby's heartbeat was strong. That was all that mattered. Lyra forced her eyes open one more time, just to make sure Arya was still latched, still warm. The baby's cheeks were pink, alive. Lyra smiled, even though it hurt. Then the stone floor began to hum. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration, deep and old, like the earth itself was waking up. Lyra felt it in her bones, in the base of her skull. The wind didn't stop, but something in the air changed. The shadows between the gargoyles above stretched down like fingers, reaching for the ground. Lyra's breath caught. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. It was full, heavy, alive. She watched as the shadows pooled near the high altar, gathering into a shape that was too tall, too still to be human. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, but this cold was different, controlled, deliberate. A man stepped out of the crypt. No, not a man. Something wearing the shape of one. He was tall, his frame wrapped in a cloak that seemed to be made of trapped smoke and starlight. The fabric didn't move with the wind. It moved against it, like the vortex itself was afraid to touch him. His skin was pale, but not the blue-white of frostbite. It was the color of marble, of something carved and perfect. His eyes glowed like dying stars. Caspian Draken stood at the edge of the altar, his head tilted as if listening to something Lyra couldn't hear. His fingers were long and claw-like, but they moved with surgical gentleness as he adjusted the collar of his cloak. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a storm in the shape of a man. Lyra tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She was too cold, too far gone. She could only watch as he descended the steps, each footfall silent, despite the ice. The snow around him didn't fall. It hovered in mid-air, waiting for permission. He stopped 3 feet away. Lyra looked up, expecting a predator, expecting teeth and hunger and the final darkness. But the wind stopped, just stopped. The air around her suddenly felt like a summer afternoon, warm and thick and impossible. She gasped, her lungs filling with heat instead of ice. Arya stirred against her chest. Caspian crouched down, his cloak pooling around him like liquid shadow. Up close, Lyra could see that his eyes weren't glowing. They were burning. A slow, controlled fire that never consumed. He studied her face, then the baby, his expression unreadable. A heartbeat this loud is a sin in a house of the dead. His voice was low, each word deliberate. Why do you give your life to a creature that cannot even say your name? Lyra's throat was too dry to answer. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. Caspian's gaze dropped to her cracked lips, then to the baby nursing at her chest. Something flickered across his face. Not pity, something older. Recognition. He reached out, and Lyra flinched. But his hand didn't touch her. It hovered above Arya's head, and the air around the baby shimmered with warmth. The frost on Lyra's skin began to melt, turning to steam. She felt sensation returning to her toes, her fingers. The pain was excruciating, but it meant she was alive. She's my daughter, Lyra finally whispered. That's why. Caspian's eyes flared brighter. He stood in one fluid motion, his cloak sweeping out like wings. The warmth intensified. wrapping around Lyra and Arya like a living thing. Lyra realized with a start that the heat wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from him. From the cloak. From the shadows that obeyed his will. "The man who locked you here." Caspian's voice was colder than the vortex. "He smells of brandy and cowardice." Lyra nodded, her teeth chattering. "Bastien Kael. He wants my inheritance." "He will not have it." It wasn't a promise. It was a fact. Caspian turned toward the iron gates, and the shadows followed him like hounds. Lyra watched as he raised one hand, his fingers spreading wide. The snow in the air began to move, swirling in a tight spiral around the gates. The metal groaned. Frost spread across the bars, thick and fast, turning the iron white. Then the frost turned to ice. Then the ice turned to something else. Something that glowed faintly blue in the moonlight. Lyra realized with a shock that he was repairing the cathedral. Not with stone. With ice. The broken arches above were filling in, the gaps sealing with crystalline precision. The wind outside howled louder, but inside the walls, the air was still. Warm, safe. Caspian lowered his hand, and the glow faded. He turned back to Lyra, his expression unreadable. She was still holding Arya, the baby now sleeping peacefully against her chest. Lyra's heartbeat was steady, strong. She met his burning gaze and saw something she didn't expect. Fury. Not at her. At the man who had left her to die. At the injustice of a mother sacrificing her warmth for a child who couldn't even speak. Caspian took a step closer, and Lyra realized he was offering his hand. "Can you stand?" Lyra looked at his palm. The skin was smooth, unlined, ageless. She hesitated, then reached out with her free hand. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth intensified. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. "Thank you," she whispered. Caspian didn't respond. He was looking at the gates again, his jaw tight. Lyra followed his gaze and saw something that made her blood run cold. There were footprints in the snow outside, fresh ones, leading back toward the tree line. Bastien had returned. He was standing just beyond the gates, his flask forgotten in the snow. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He was staring at Caspian, at the ice-sealed cathedral, at the impossible warmth radiating from the ruins. Caspian smiled. It was not a kind smile. The smile on Caspian's face was not meant for the living. Bastien stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the ice. The flask fell from his hand, the brandy hissing as it hit the frozen ground. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Only a thin wheeze, like air escaping from something punctured. Caspian moved. One moment he was standing beside Lyra. The next, he was at the gates, his palm pressed flat against the iron bars. The metal screamed. Not from heat, from cold so absolute it became something else entirely. The bars turned white, then blue, then black. They shattered into dust that the wind carried away like ash. Bastien ran. He made it 3 steps before the shadows caught him. They didn't grab. They simply appeared in front of him, a wall of living darkness that smelled like winter graves. He fell backward, scrambling through the snow on his hands and knees. His wolf fur coat dragged behind him, collecting ice. "Please," he gasped. "Please, I didn't mean—" "You locked a mother and child in a tomb." Caspian's voice cut through the vortex like a blade. You drank while they froze. Bastian's face went grey. Lyra watched from inside the cathedral, her arms tightening around Arya. She should have felt triumph, justice. But all she felt was cold. The warmth Caspian had given her was fading, seeping out through the holes in the stone walls. She started to shiver again. Caspian's head turned. He looked at her across the distance, those burning eyes locking onto hers. Something passed between them. Not words, understanding. He raised one hand toward Bastien, and the shadows wrapped around the man's throat. Not choking, holding. Stay, Caspian commanded. Then he was moving again, crossing the space between the gates and the pillar in 3 impossible strides. His cloak billowed behind him, the fabric catching moonlight and swallowing it whole. He stopped in front of Lyra, close enough that she could see the frost forming on his eyelashes. You're still cold, he said. It wasn't a question. Lyra nodded, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. Arya stirred against her chest, making a small sound of protest. The baby was warm, but Lyra's body was failing. She could feel it. The way her heartbeat was becoming irregular again, the numbness creeping back into her toes. Caspian reached for the clasp at his throat. His fingers moved with surgical precision, unfastening the heavy bronze pin that held the cloak in place. The fabric slid from his shoulders like liquid shadow, revealing a frame that was too perfect to be human. His shirt was black silk, tailored to a body that didn't bend, didn't breathe. He held the cloak out to her. This will not fail you, he said. Lyra stared at the offered fabric. Up close, she could see that the exterior was woven from something that looked like smoke and starlight. But the interior, the lining, was different. It was fur, deep, midnight black fur that seemed to pulse with its own light. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched it. Heat exploded through her hand. Not painful, not burning, just pure, impossible warmth that spread up her arm and into her chest like liquid gold. She gasped, her eyes going wide. Caspian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those burning eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or recognition. Take it, he said. Lyra shifted Arya in her arms, trying to figure out how to accept the cloak without dropping the baby. Caspian saw her struggle and stepped closer. His hands were cold when they touched her shoulders, but his movements were gentle. He draped the cloak around both of them, wrapping the fabric so that it cocooned Lyra and Arya together. The warmth was instant, agonizing, beautiful. Lyra felt the needles of frostbite vanish as if they'd never existed. The blue tint in her fingers faded to pink. Sensation returned to her toes in a rush that made her gasp. She looked down and saw that the fur lining was glowing faintly, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. What is this? She whispered. A gift from a queen who no longer needs it. Caspian's voice was soft. The cloak of the eternal hearth. It will keep you warm until the stars go dark. Lyra pulled the fabric tighter, marveling at the weight of it. The cloak was massive, designed for someone much larger than her. But it didn't feel heavy. It felt like being held. Like being protected by something ancient and absolute. Arya stopped fussing. The baby settled against Lyra's chest, her tiny fist curling into the fur. Lyra looked up at Caspian, searching his face for some hint of why he was doing this, why he cared. but his expression was unreadable. Alien. He was watching her the way a sculptor might watch a piece of marble, deciding where to make the first cut. "Thank you," Lyra said. Caspian tilted his head. "You thank me for not letting you die. The bar is low for your species." There was no cruelty in his voice, just observation. Lyra felt her cheeks flush, though whether from embarrassment or the warmth of the cloak, she couldn't tell. She adjusted her grip on Arya, making sure the baby was still latched properly. Caspian's gaze dropped to the nursing child. He stared for a long moment, his expression shifting into something Lyra couldn't name. Not hunger, not disgust, something older. He reached out slowly, giving Lyra time to pull away. When she didn't, he touched Arya's cheek with one finger. The tip was black, like onyx, like a claw filed down to something almost human. "I have not seen a mother's milk in 500 years, he said quietly. His voice had changed. The cold authority was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded almost like grief. Lyra held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over them. "It smells like starlight and survival," Caspian continued. He withdrew his hand, and Lyra saw that his fingers were trembling. Just slightly. Just enough to prove he wasn't made of stone. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something human in those burning eyes. Loss. "This place is no longer a ruin," he said. "It is your fortress." Lyra blinked. "What?" Caspian turned away from her, his gaze sweeping across the broken cathedral. The shattered stained glass. The crumbling arches, the gaps in the walls where the vortex screamed through like a living thing. He raised both hands, his fingers spreading wide. The shadows obeyed. They poured from his palms like water, flowing up the stone pillars and across the broken ceiling. Lyra watched in stunned silence as the darkness filled the gaps, sealing the holes with something that looked like frozen smoke. But it wasn't smoke. It was ice, crystalline and perfect, glowing with a faint amber light. The wind stopped. Not outside, inside. The vortex was still raging beyond the walls, but inside the cathedral, the air was suddenly still, warm, safe. Lyra looked up and saw that the shattered stained glass was being repaired. Not with colored glass, with ice that refracted the moonlight into 1,000 different hues. Blue, gold, crimson, green. The light danced across the stone floor, turning the ruins into something beautiful, something sacred. Caspian lowered his hands, and the glow intensified. The ice walls thickened, becoming opaque. Solid, impenetrable. "How?" Lyra started. "I'm old," Caspian said simply. "The cold obeys me because it knows I am colder." He turned back to her, and Lyra realized with a start that she wasn't shivering anymore. The cathedral was warm. Not just warm, perfect. Like a summer evening. Like her mother's kitchen. She looked down at Arya and saw that the baby had fallen asleep. Her tiny mouth still latched, but no longer drinking. Lyra carefully unlatched her. She adjusted her shirt, pulling the fabric back into place. Her fingers were steady now, strong. She looked up at Caspian and saw that he was watching her with that same unreadable expression. Not judging. Just observing. "You're not human," she said. "No? What are you?" Caspian's smile was sharp. The thing your husband should have feared more than poverty. Lyra's breath caught. He's not my husband. Not anymore. Good. The word was final. Absolute. Caspian turned toward the sealed entrance, where Bastian was still trapped in the shadows. Lyra could see the man's silhouette through the amber-glowing ice. He was on his knees, his hands pressed against the barrier, begging. What are you going to do to him? Lyra asked. Caspian didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the ice wall, his footsteps silent on the stone. When he reached it, he pressed his palm flat against the surface. The amber light flared brighter, and Lyra heard Bastian scream. I am going to teach him the difference between cold and cruelty, Caspian said. The ice began to crack, not breaking, spreading, like veins of frost racing across glass. Lyra watched as the cracks formed a pattern. The pattern spread across the ice like veins. Lyra watched the frost race outward from Caspian's palm, forming shapes that looked almost like words in a language she didn't recognize. The amber light pulsed brighter with each passing second, and through the translucent barrier, she could see Bastian's mouth moving. Screaming probably, but no sound reached her. Caspian pulled his hand back. The ice sealed completely, turning opaque. The screaming stopped, or maybe it was just muffled now, trapped on the other side of the crystalline wall. Lyra shifted Arya in her arms, the baby's weight suddenly feeling heavier, more real. Is he dead? She whispered. Not yet. Caspian turned to face her. Death is a mercy I have not yet decided to grant. His eyes had dimmed to a low simmer, like coals instead of flames. He looked at the sleeping baby in her arms, then at the cloak wrapped around them both. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one. Rest, he said. The sanctuary will hold. Lyra wanted to argue, to ask what came next. But exhaustion hit her like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders until her knees threatened to buckle. The warmth of the cloak was making her drowsy, pulling her towards sleep with gentle, insistent hands. She sank down onto the stone floor. The marble was warm beneath her. Not cold, not hard. It felt like sitting on sun-baked earth in the middle of summer. Lyra leaned back against the pillar, cradling Arya against her chest. The baby's heartbeat was steady, strong, alive. Lyra closed her eyes. She didn't mean to sleep, but the darkness pulled her under like water, and she was too tired to fight it. The last thing she heard was the sound of ice cracking somewhere far away, and Caspian's voice, low and deliberate, speaking words she couldn't understand. Then nothing. Lyra woke to the sound of boots on stone. Her eyes snapped open, her arms tightening around Arya instinctively. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked around the cathedral, trying to orient herself. The amber light was still glowing, but it had dimmed. The ice walls were still intact, but something felt different. Wrong. The sound came again. Boots. Heavy ones. Multiple pairs. Lyra scrambled to her feet, the cloak billowing around her like wings. She pressed her back against the pillar and listened. The footsteps were coming from outside, crunching through snow. Getting closer. She looked toward the sealed entrance and saw shadows moving beyond the ice. 3 of them. Her breath caught. Bastian. He'd come back. But he wasn't alone this time. Lyra could see the shapes of 2 larger figures flanking him, their silhouettes distorted by the crystalline barrier. One of them was carrying something that flickered. Fire. A torch. "What is this?" Bastian's voice cut through the ice like a blade. "Who started a fire in my ruins?" Lyra's stomach dropped. He thought the glow was from a fire. He thought someone had broken into his property. She looked around frantically for Caspian, but the vampire was nowhere to be seen. The shadows near the altar were empty. Still, the lock rattled. Lyra heard metal scraping against metal, then a sharp crack, the sound of something breaking. She watched in horror as the ice around the entrance began to fracture, spider webs of cracks spreading outward from a single point. Bastian was breaking through. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The barrier shattered. Not all at once. Just a section near the gates, large enough for a man to step through. Bastian entered first, his wolf fur coat dusted with fresh snow. He was holding a crowbar, the metal still steaming from where it had struck the ice. Behind him came two men Lyra didn't recognize. Hired muscle. One held a torch. The other held a club. Bastian's eyes swept the cathedral. When they landed on Lyra, his face went pale, then red, then something darker. He took a step forward, his boots echoing on the stone. The torchbearer followed, the firelight casting long shadows across the walls. "You!" Bastian hissed. "You're supposed to be dead!" Lyra didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed up, her voice trapped somewhere between her lungs and her mouth. She clutched Arya tighter, the baby's warmth the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Bastian's gaze dropped to the cloak. His eyes widened, then narrowed. He took another step forward, the crowbar hanging loose in his hand. The metal caught the torchlight, gleaming like a threat. "Give me that cloak, you thief." His voice was low, dangerous. "It looks like it's worth more than your life." Lyra backed up. Her spine hit the pillar, and she realized with a sickening jolt that she had nowhere left to go. Bastian was between her and the entrance. The two henchmen were spreading out, flanking her. The torchbearer moved to her left. The one with the club moved to her right. She was trapped. Bastian smiled. The same smile he'd worn when he locked the gates. The smile of a man who'd already won. He reached out with his free hand, fingers grasping for the edge of the cloak. "I'll take that," he said. His fingers brushed the fabric. The torch went out, not flickered, not dimmed, extinguished, as if someone had reached out and crushed the flame between invisible fingers. The torchbearer yelped, dropping the stick. It hit the ground with a clatter, the wood already covered in a thin layer of frost. The temperature plummeted. Lyra felt it like a physical blow, the warmth of the cloak suddenly fighting against a cold so absolute it made the vortex outside feel like a summer breeze. Her breath came out in visible puffs. Arya whimpered, and Lyra pulled the cloak tighter, shielding the baby from the sudden chill. Bastian stumbled backward. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He was staring at something behind Lyra. Something that made the color drain from his cheeks and the crowbar slip from his fingers. The metal hit the stone with a sound like a bell tolling. Lyra turned. Caspian stood behind the altar. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Lyra was certain of it. But now he was there, as if he'd always been there, as if the shadows had simply parted to reveal him. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. He was just existing. A presence so absolute it made the air feel heavy. The henchman backed toward the entrance. Caspian's eyes tracked them. Not glowing now. Burning. A deep, hungry red that looked like the last light of a dying sun. He tilted his head, the movement slow and deliberate, like a predator deciding which prey to take first. You locked the door on a queen. His voice was soft, lethal. Now, you will learn the weight of the winter you invited in. The second torch shattered. Not the flame, the wood. It exploded into splinters of ice that rained down on the stone floor like frozen rain. The henchman holding it screamed, dropping the remains and clutching his hand. Frost was spreading up his fingers, turning the skin blue. Bastian ran for the entrance. He made it 2 steps before the shadows caught him. They didn't grab. They simply appeared in front of him. A wall of living darkness that smelled like old graves and older promises. He fell backward, his boots slipping on the ice-slicked floor. "Please," he gasped. "Please, I didn't know." "You knew." Caspian descended the altar steps. "You drank while she froze." Each word was a nail in a coffin. Lyra watched as Caspian crossed the distance between the altar and Bastian in 3 impossible strides. His cloak, no, not his cloak anymore, hers, billowed behind him like smoke. But he was still wearing something, a shirt of black silk that seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. The henchmen bolted. They ran for the shattered entrance, their boots pounding on stone. Caspian didn't stop them. He didn't even look at them. His attention was fixed entirely on Bastian, who was now crawling backward across the floor. His hands scrabbling for purchase on the ice. Caspian stopped in front of him. He crouched down, his movements fluid and unhurried. Up close, Lyra could see that his eyes weren't just red. They were layered. Crimson over amber over something darker. Something ancient. He reached out and grabbed Bastian by the throat. Not choking. Holding. "Lyra!" Caspian's voice cut through the silence. "Take the child into the inner sanctum." Lyra blinked. "What?" "The door behind the altar." His eyes never left Bastian's face. "Go. Now." Lyra looked at the altar, then at the door she hadn't noticed before. It was small, carved into the stone wall, almost invisible in the shadows. She hesitated, her arms tightening around Arya. "Go!" Caspian repeated. His voice was still soft, still controlled. But underneath it was something else. Something that made Lyra's Lyra ran. She clutched Arya to her chest and stumbled through the shadows toward the door behind the altar. Her bare feet slapped against stone that was no longer warm. The temperature had dropped so fast her breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. Behind her, Bastian was screaming. She didn't look back. Couldn't. The sound of his terror was enough. Lyra reached the door and shoved it open with her shoulder, the wood groaning on ancient hinges. She fell through into darkness, the cloak billowing around her like protective wings. The door slammed shut. Silence swallowed her whole. Lyra pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Arya was crying now. Soft hiccuping sobs that meant she was scared but not hurt. Lyra rocked her gently, whispering nonsense words that her own mother had once whispered to her. The screaming stopped. Lyra froze. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the noise had been. She strained to hear what was happening on the other side of the door, but the wood was too thick. Or maybe Caspian had sealed it with ice. She couldn't tell. Minutes passed like hours. Lyra sank down onto the floor, her legs finally giving out. The room she was in was small, barely larger than a closet. But it was warm. The cloak saw to that. She adjusted Arya in her arms, checking the baby's fingers and toes. All pink, all perfect. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're okay." She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Arya or herself. The door opened. Lyra's head snapped up, her arms tightening around the baby. But it was Caspian who stepped through, his silhouette filling the doorway. His eyes had dimmed back to their usual simmer, and his hands were clean. No blood. No evidence of violence. "It's done," he said. Lyra's throat was too dry to respond. She just nodded, her gaze searching his face for some hint of what had happened. But his expression was unreadable, carved from marble and moonlight. "Come," Caspian said. "There is something you need to see." He offered his hand. Lyra hesitated, then reached out. His fingers closed around hers, and he pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. She followed him back through the door, into the main chamber of the cathedral. The courtyard had changed. The floor was no longer stone. It was ice. Perfectly transparent ice that stretched from wall to wall, smooth as glass and just as clear. Lyra could see through it, down into darkness that seemed to go on forever. She took a step forward, her bare foot touching the surface. It was warm, not hot, not burning, just pleasantly warm like sun-baked earth. Lyra looked at Caspian in confusion, but he was already moving toward the center of the courtyard. She followed, her steps careful on the slick surface. Then she saw him. Bastian was beneath the ice. Not dead, not sleeping, frozen. His body was suspended in the crystalline floor like an insect trapped in amber, his arms spread wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes were open, staring up at the sky he could no longer reach. Lyra's breath caught. "He's alive," Caspian said. It wasn't a question. His heart beats once every hour. His lungs fill once every day. He will watch the world move above him for as long as the ice holds. "How long is that?" Lyra whispered. "Forever." The word hung in the air like a sentence. Lyra looked down at Bastian's frozen face and felt nothing. No pity, no triumph. Just a hollow kind of relief that he could never hurt her again. Never hurt Arya. "You wanted the inheritance," Caspian said, his voice soft and lethal. "Now you are the foundation. Stay and support her steps." He was talking to Bastian, to the man who could hear but not respond. Lyra watched as Caspian crouched down, pressing his palm flat against the ice, directly above Bastian's face. The surface glowed amber for a moment, then faded. "Every footstep she takes will press down on you," Caspian continued. "Every breath her daughter takes will be a reminder of the warmth you tried to steal. You will hold up her world until the stars burn out." Bastian's eyes moved. Just slightly. Just enough to show he understood. Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She looked away, focusing instead on the walls of the cathedral. They were still sealed with ice, but the amber glow had softened to something gentler, golden. "What happens now?" she asked. Caspian stood, brushing imaginary dust from his hands. "Now, you rest." The storm will pass by morning. And then? Then you walk out of here as something more than you were when you walked in. His eyes met hers, and Lyra saw something in them she hadn't expected. Not hunger. Not calculation, respect. He turned and walked toward the altar. His movements fluid and unhurried. Lyra watched him go, questions piling up in her throat. Why did you save us? The words came out before she could stop them. Caspian paused. He didn't turn around. Just stood there, his back to her, his shoulders perfectly still. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it, because the world needs more things that refuse to break in the dark. Then he was gone. Not walking away, just gone. The shadows swallowed him whole, and Lyra was alone in the cathedral with her sleeping daughter, and the man frozen beneath her feet. She looked down at Bastien one more time. His eyes were still open, still aware. She wondered what he was thinking. If he was screaming inside his own head. If he understood the weight of what he'd done. But she didn't wonder long. Arya stirred against her chest, making a small sound of contentment. Lyra walked to the pillar and sat down. The cloak wrapped around them both, warm and protective. She leaned her head back against the stone and closed her eyes. Exhaustion pulled at her like a tide, but this time she didn't fight it. She let herself drift, knowing that when she woke, the world would be different. Better. Morning came, with light that didn't hurt. Lyra opened her eyes to find the cathedral bathed in golden sunshine that streamed through the ice walls like stained glass. The amber glow had faded, replaced by something softer, warmer. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Arya. The baby was still sleeping, her tiny fist curled into the fur lining of the cloak. Lyra looked around and realized the storm had stopped. The vortex was gone. Outside the walls, she could see blue sky and white snow that sparkled like diamonds. The world looked clean, new, like something had been washed away in the night. You're awake? Lyra's head snapped toward the altar. Caspian was standing there, exactly where he'd been the night before. Or maybe he'd never left. She couldn't tell. He looked the same, ageless, perfect, terrifying. The storm passed, she said. It did. Caspian descended the steps and crossed the courtyard. His boots made no sound on the ice floor. When he reached her, he extended his hand. Lyra took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Her legs were steady now, strong. Come, he said. There's something you need to see. He led her to a window she hadn't noticed before. It was set high in the wall, framed by ice that refracted the sunlight into 1,000 colors. Lyra looked out and gasped. The city below was covered in snow, but it wasn't the dead white of the vortex. It was clean, pristine, beautiful. And in the distance, she could see the towers of the northern valleys, the estate that had once belonged to her family, the estate Bastien had tried to steal. It's yours again, Caspian said. Lyra turned to look at him. What? The ledgers have been rewritten, the deeds transferred. You are the Duchess of the Northern Valleys. His eyes met hers. As you always should have been. How? I am old, Lyra, and the old have influence in places the young cannot reach. His voice was matter of fact. Matter of fact. As if rewriting city records was no more difficult than mending a broken window. Lyra looked back out at the estate, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't need to." Caspian stepped back. "You only need to walk out of here and claim what is yours." Lyra looked down at her hands. They were no longer blue, no longer cracked and bleeding. They were warm, steady, strong. She flexed her fingers, marveling at the simple act of movement without pain. "Why?" she asked again. "Why did you do this?" Caspian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because 500 years ago I watched a queen die in the snow while her court drank wine and pretended not to hear her screams." His eyes burned brighter. "I will not watch it happen again." The weight of those words settled over Lyra like a blanket. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Grief. Old and deep and absolute. The kind of greed that didn't heal. It just learned to wear a different face. "Thank you," she said. Caspian's expression didn't change. "Don't thank me. Just survive. That's payment enough." He turned and walked back toward the altar. Lyra watched him go, questions still piling up in her throat. But she didn't ask them. Some things, she realized, were better left in the dark. She looked down at Arya. The baby was awake now, her dark eyes staring up at Lyra with that unfocused intensity that newborns had. Lyra smiled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. The baby's skin was warm, alive, perfect. "Come on, little one," Lyra whispered. "Let's go home." She walked toward the entrance, her bare feet warm on the ice floor. The barrier had been repaired, but as she approached, it melted away like morning frost. The gates swung open on silent hinges, revealing the path beyond. Lyra paused at the threshold. She looked back one more time, searching the shadows for Caspian. But he was gone. Or maybe he'd never been there at all. Just a dream, a nightmare, a salvation wrapped in darkness and starlight. She stepped out into the snow. The path down the mountain was clear. The ice melted away to reveal stone steps that led toward the city. Lyra adjusted the cloak around Arya and started walking. Her feet were steady, her heartbeat strong. She didn't look back, not at the cathedral, not at the ruins, not at the man frozen beneath the courtyard floor. She just walked, one foot in front of the other, toward the life that had been stolen from her and then returned. The city below was waking up. Lyra could hear the sounds of mourning, bells ringing, voices calling, the distant clatter of carts on cobblestone. Normal sounds, human sounds. She descended the steps slowly, savoring the simple act of movement, of being alive. Halfway down, she paused. There was something beneath her feet. She looked down and realized the path was no longer stone. It was ice. Clear, transparent ice that stretched from the cathedral all the way to the city gates. And beneath it, frozen in eternal stillness, was a face. Bastian's face. His eyes were open, staring up at her with an expression of absolute terror. Lyra looked down at him, at the man who had tried to kill her and her daughter, the man who had locked them in a tomb and walked away laughing. She stepped over him without breaking stride. Her foot pressed down on the ice directly above his face, and she felt the surface warm beneath her soul, supporting her, holding her up, just as Caspian had promised. She kept walking, her steps steady and sure. Behind her, the cathedral stood silent against the morning sky. Inside, in the shadows near the altar, something ancient watched her go. Not